Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Mark Henry. I'm a senior engineer with Opmantek's North American office located in Charlotte, North Carolina. Today we're going to talk about how to install, set up, and configure Opmantek's NMIS network monitoring solution. So if you're watching this video live on GoToWebinar, we will be following up with everyone with an email with a link to the recording. If you have any questions, depending on which version of the GoToMeeting software you have installed on your system, you will either use the chat window or the questions panel. Also, if you're on the GoToMeeting, if you'll check the handout panel, you'll find a PDF with a copy of today's presentation in it. If you're viewing this video on Opmantek's YouTube channel or on Opmantek's website, you should find the download for the PDF with that presentation. If you're here with GoToWebinar, upon completion of the webinar, if you happen to leave early, you'll be presented with a short exit survey. Please take a moment and complete it. So what are we going to talk about today? We're going to cover a little bit of what's new in the latest release of NMIS, which is 8.6.7G, G for gold. We're going to talk a bit about what's in that release and what you can look forward to. We'll talk a bit about the prerequisites. So what kind of a server, a hosting server do you need? What kind of specifications do you need on it? And how to get NMIS installed. Then we'll talk about the NMIS setup, and finally NMIS configuration. I always like to marry these presentations back to Gartner's IT Service Management Maturity Model. So if you just consider the features that NMIS brings to the table, so setting aside all of Opmantek's other solutions, including device discovery and auditing with Open Audit, our dashboarding tools, our event management, NetFlow, IPFix, etc. If you set those other solutions aside for a moment and just focus on NMIS, NMIS actually brings a tremendous amount of features and value to an organization. So right off the bat, just installing NMIS, adding your devices to it will solidly move you into a level 1 and into a level 2 position point. By properly setting up and configuring your NMIS installation, you can move well into level 3 and head into level 4, which of course, the higher up, the further to the right on this model that you get as an IT service group, the more performance and higher value to your organization you provide. So a few useful references. Don't worry about trying to copy these down. Again, if you look at the GoToWebinar handouts panel or at the Opmantek website, you can get a PDF version of this with all these links in it. But keep in mind, we do keep very, very detailed release notes for all of our products available. All of the downloads, so whether you want to install NMIS on your own operating system or if you want to download Opmantek's virtual machine, which already has NMIS and other products already pre-installed on it, just simply go to the opmantek.com website, the downloads section, and everything can be found right there. We also have a fully detailed wiki, so all of our documentation is online. We do use Confluence to host everything there, so please take a look. Lots of good content in the wiki. If you do, however, have a question, feel free to post it to the community questions board. The Opmantek engineers look at that every day, and a lot of Opmantek community members also come by the questions board and add their 2 cents in with suggestions and recommendations. One note before we move on, we are actively working on NMIS 9 currently, which is in a kind of a late beta release. So if you're interested in experimenting with NMIS 9, and I do not recommend at this point that it be put into a production environment, but if you're looking at playing around with NMIS 9 and seeing the features and functionality it brings to the table, please shoot us an email at beta@opmantek.com. We'll be happy to send you a link for download. So what is new in the latest release of NMIS? So the last one of these videos that we did was earlier this spring on version 8.6.3G. And since then, we've had a lot of really, really cool functionality added to the suite. To start off with, we've greatly improved the overall installation experience. There are less manual steps in the installation. It's much more automated than it was just 9 months ago. Many of the things that were optional, that were not installed automatically, are now installed automatically for you behind the scenes. We've also greatly improved the speed of the NMIS dashboard, the way the widgets draw, the way they refresh, and also the way that you can drill into any of the drill-in graphs, the expandable graphs that we'll show you later. Everything loads much faster than it has in the past, much more lighter weight, and takes advantage of a lot of the modern browsers and HTML5 rendering options. There's also greater and improved robustness for service monitoring, and also greater resiliency for what we call the nodes.nmis file. And what I really mean by that is that a lot of the support inquiries that we have over the years often revolve around issues caused by adding devices to the system that NMIS can't process for one reason or another. It has a bad name, it has a bad IP address, it can't be connected to, there isn't a model appropriate for it, the device doesn't respond, etc. And so we've added a lot of automation and, quite frankly, some really good heuristics around those concepts. So NMIS takes care of itself better. It looks after its own health. It'll give you a lot of warnings and notations about things that aren't working or won't work. We've also added a new polling failover feature. Generally speaking, in the past, you've had to provide either an individual IP address or a fully qualified domain name. Now you can have a primary and a secondary or a fallback IP address. And so if for some reason NMIS can't reach your device using the primary IP address or fully qualified domain name, it can use the secondary IP address and continue communicating with that device, polling it, collecting information on it. We've also added a host of new and improved device support. A whole list of devices here, many more actually that are not on this list. A big piece to 867 really has also been the concept of being able to demote devices that have never responded to a poll. And so it's not just a poll for whether it's SNMP or WMI, but it's also devices that have never responded to ping, so ICMP. So if you add a device to NMIS and it just simply doesn't respond, after a few polling cycles, NMIS will actually demote the device. So rather than trying to poll it with every polling cycle and then continuing that kind of process, it'll demote it and then ping it only once per hour, and then eventually once per day, and it'll log that message about the demotion, and you'll get an event specifically for it. The whole concept there, again, is to try to automate as much as possible in the way of general housekeeping, and take less work, or take more work rather, off the engineers' shoulders, and automate as much as possible right up front. So how do we get NMIS installed? There are really two choices that are available to you. You can download the NMIS installer. It does require a 64-bit Linux operating system as its host platform. It also requires internet access so they can get to repositories and CPAN, etc., to get all the pieces and goodies that go and make up NMIS. So you can install NMIS from scratch on your own OS. You can also download Opmantek's virtual appliance. And it's really nothing more than a CentOS VM. It's based on CentOS 6.9. It's pre-configured with just 2 virtual CPU, 2 gigs of RAM, and a 40 gigabyte hard drive. So when you download the VM, it's small, it's compact. It comes out as an OVA file. You should be able to install it into any VMware vSphere client that you have. We do have a few configuration options. You can actually convert the file from an OVA to an OVF, or whatever other intermediary file you need for your host system. We do include those instructions on the installation getting started page that's quoted here. One note, you should, once you spin up the, if you go with the virtual machine, once you spin it up, we highly recommend that you resize the virtual machine for the total number of devices you will have in the future. You can do it later on. It can take a little bit of time, especially if the hard drives have to resize or the database has to adjust. So, give that some thought up front, and do whatever sizing as close as you can to what you'll actually need. And we'll cover specifications on size in a couple slides here. So once you get either NMIS installed or the virtual machine spun up and resized, you're ready for setup and configuration. A little bit more detail on how to install NMIS from scratch. You can download the NMIS installer directly from the Opmantek download page. That also goes for the virtual machine as well. We keep all of the latest versions there. If for some reason you need an older version of any of our installers, just reach out to us either at contact@opmantek.com or support@opmantek.com. We'll be happy to get you a download link for one of the older versions if you need it. As I mentioned before, the NMIS installer does require internet access to get to the repositories and to CPAN. There are options on our website and our wiki on how to deal with either a connection or server with limited network access or no net access. So there are ways to work around that. You, of course, have to configure Selinux and IP tables appropriately so that the application can run and so that it can communicate with the devices across your network. The NMIS installer, as it comes, not only does a fresh install, but it will also handle upgrading an existing installation. And that has been tested all the way back to NMIS 4. So if you have an NMIS 4 installation, you should be able to run the new NMIS 867G installer and upgrade directly from there. If you have questions on upgrading from very early versions of NMIS, again, please feel free to reach out, ask the questions on the questions board if you want to, or again, reach out to contact@Opmantek or support@Opmantek. We're happy to help you out in upgrading your installation. The installer itself, I mentioned earlier, some of the great improvements over the last 9 months. Not only is the installer more robust, it does a lot more, but it also does a lot more right at the command line. So for example, you can actually take the installer, which is nothing more than a installation script on top of a tarball, all inside a .run kind of source piece. You can actually unpack it automatically. You can install it to a non-standard directory or location. You can run automatic kind of unguided installations. So if you want to be able to do some DevOps and automate spinning up, installing NMIS, configuring it, you can absolutely do that through some DevOps processes. And you can even do a manual install. So you can have it unpack and save the files into a directory structure, and then you can manually run the installer at that point. So a lot of good options there if you want to start from scratch. We often get questions about, well, how long does it take? How many people do I need? Do they need to be PhDs? And the answer to all that is, it depends. So frankly, if you're going to spin up an instance of NMIS, if you think that you can do it all on one server, let's say that you've got a moderately sized server, you've got between 500 and 1,000 devices you want to monitor, several thousand interfaces potentially, I would plan for having one kind of part-time employee dedicated to that between 2 and 3 days worth of time. Now, it doesn't take 2 to 3 days to install NMIS and add devices to it. Frankly, we did a 500 device install just last week. It took us about 20 minutes to download, set up, configure NMIS, and then import a list of 500 devices to it and have NMIS start polling it. About 20 minutes start to finish. What takes the time is planning and preparation. It's making sure that your network security is set up right, that your ports and protocols are correct, that your NMIS server is built properly and sized appropriately, and that it can reach all your devices. It's collecting all of your devices' SNMP community strings or WMI credentials. It's making sure that whichever community strings you have, whether you're using SNMP version 1, 2C, or 3, that you have all of the right permissions, you have all of the right passwords and user accounts, etc., ready to go. And once you have all that, it's about 15 to 20 minutes to get a 500 device server up and running. Looking forward to after the system is set up and running, what are you looking at? How much feeding and care does NMIS require? Really, I try to suggest for each NMIS server that you have an employee who can do about 2 hours a week. That's not 2 hours in necessarily one shift. It might be 20 minutes a day throughout the week, maybe one day where they spend 30 or 45 minutes going through logs, reviewing the different options, adjusting the way NMIS works, adding in a few more notification systems to it, and just making sure that it's humming along well. But it's really not a tremendous amount of time. The biggest part of that really is the device lifecycle. Adding devices to NMIS, adjusting device settings, and retiring devices that have come off your network. Anytime that we're doing this, obviously something that you do more than a couple of times a month, you want to look for some way to automate it. Many ways we've done that is connecting into some kind of a CMDB. So whether that's something like ConnectWise or like ServiceNow, or if you're using Opmantek's Open Audit solution, is being able to use some kind of a device discovery and auditing piece to keep track of devices, to be kind of the inventory point, and then using that to feed NMIS and keep it up to date on new devices, keeping those devices configured properly, and then retiring devices that are retired in whatever CMDB solution you use. So we have some great articles, wiki articles, and a couple of videos on our website along those lines as well. Please take a look at those if you're considering using NMIS as your network monitoring tool. And finally, this is a piece that has actually tested out really, really well at many of our larger NOC sites. So these are clients who are running really massive managed service providers with several hundreds of thousands of devices. Usually they're multinational or even across several continents. And so from our perspective, in working with their teams and working with the way the system is configured and dashboards are laid out, we've really come to the conclusion that a single engineer can really effectively support anywhere between 8,000 and 12,000 devices on a shift. So depending on how many devices you have, obviously that scales. It's not really a linear growth. The more devices you have, you can actually kind of tone that down. So you could go to 24,000 with 2 engineers. You could probably go to 36 with 2.5 or 3, and get up to 50,000 with 4 people on a shift. But what it really comes down to is understanding what other things that those engineers need to do. In our mind, those engineers are simply monitoring the dashboards, responding to events that are being posted by the system, following up and making sure that the system is up and running and responding and working correctly, gathering information, and that they're able to troubleshoot effectively at that point. All right, a bit on NMIS server sizing, and this goes whether you're using the NMIS virtual machine or the Opmantek virtual machine rather, or if you've installed NMIS on your own operating system. So again, we ship with just configured for 2 virtual CPU, 2 gigabytes, and about 40 gigs of storage. So you may want to increase that storage a little bit to get to the small size, but a small size machine server will be able to handle about 500 devices and around 2,000 elements. Now, generally speaking, the big piece on elements are interfaces. It's not counting up all the little bits and pieces, memory, CPU, and all those types of things. A medium size implementation might be 8 virtual CPU, 16 gigs of RAM, and that'll handle about 2,500 devices or 20,000 elements. A large implementation would handle 12. You'd be looking at 12 CPU, 32 gigs of RAM, about 320 gigs of hard drive space, just for storage, not for the operating system, just for data. That'll handle upwards of 5,000 devices. And so we have several clients now, again, ISPs, managed service providers, who have large implementations, 25, 30 NMIS servers running at that large specification, each one handling between 3,000 and 5,000 devices, again, depending on the total number of really interfaces being collected on. The deciding factor in almost every case is not necessarily the amount of devices or elements or even interfaces, it's the disk write performance. So can NMIS write to the disk fast enough, whatever your storage medium is, fast enough to keep up with all of the data that's being collected and posted to the system? That's really the deciding factor in many cases, especially if you're going to upgrade from NMIS and add in OP charts or OP events, any of our pieces that use MongoDB as the backend rather than just RRD. which NMIS does, then you're definitely looking at something that requires very, very fast storage capability. A few deployment considerations for everyone. So keeping in mind things like network security restrictions, like DMZs. Had an interesting client discussion the other day. Clients running a couple of data centers where they do a lot of credit card processing. So each data center has its own PCI DSS zone. And what their auditors would not allow was for a network monitoring solution to be outside the zone, reaching in through the zone to pull performance data from devices. And so what we did is we worked with the client on an architecture plan to actually deploy an NMIS server inside the PCI DSS zone just to audit and handle polling and performance monitoring of devices and services inside that zone. And then we put a master server outside the zone, and that internal polling engine was able to push information to the master server. And so the master server had kind of an overall view of every polling server that the client had and pulled all that information together. And they still maintained their PCI DSS compliance as far as the auditing team went. You want to, of course, keep track of your restrictions for inbound and outbound connections. We document these very well on the Opmantek wiki. So if you take a look at the NMIS section of the wiki, it goes into what ports and protocols have to be open in which direction for polling servers, for master servers, etc. And you also want to keep a lookout for limitations on credentials. Working with the support team, we ran into a situation not long ago where a client was only getting back a very limited amount of data from a whole host of their devices. And it turned out that the SNMP community strings they had didn't have full unrestricted read-only access to that device. It was limited to a small handful of MIB branches, basically the system branch of the MIB tree. And so all the detailed information we needed about interfaces and CPU and memory and all of that wasn't being pulled back. And it came down to it was a credentials issue. So once you've downloaded NMIS, if you've run the installer, or you've downloaded the virtual machine and you've spun it up and you've resized it and you're ready to go, the next step is working through the NMIS setup. So NMIS has been out in the marketplace now for more than 18 years. And in all that time, I think one of the key things that we've really learned is to set NMIS up in a way so that when you install it, it's good to go for about 80% of everyone who needs to use the product. Now, yes, absolutely, the other 20% needs to be able to turn knobs, flip switches, turn dials, and make the system work the way they need it to. But for 80% of the people who will download NMIS over the next month, they just download it, install it, add devices to it, and it just works. And we really recommend that you start with the defaults to get you started, add a few nodes and devices to it, make sure that it's talking to them, it's pulling information, and you understand what the information the system's giving you. Sort out any basic connectivity issues, decide on groups, which is a way of grouping together devices, and then start any kind of a configuration if required at that point. But give it a couple of days, give it a handful of days to settle out and for you to learn about how NMIS works and the information it gives you before you start making changes to the default configurations. So I'm going to switch over now to NMIS. So when you first install and bring NMIS up, this is what you'll see on the screen. I'm going to close out some windows in the background here just to make it easier for everyone so we can focus in. The piece you see on the screen now, what we call a widget panel. This is the basic setup widget. This was a big improvement that we released about 1.5 years ago to pull together settings that were spread out over multiple different menu options. And so from here, some of the things that you want to be able to make sure that you add in, give your server a name. This is a plain language name that you're going to call it. You might call it Polling Engine 2. You might call it Master Server 5. You might call it, NMIS server, whatever. You want to provide it with the NMIS host. Again, this is a fully qualified domain name or IP address. That is important because as emails are generated by NMIS to notify people or to create help desk tickets, it's going to create and add links into those emails that come back to the NMIS server and that are live. And so if you don't populate the NMIS host with a working, fully qualified domain name or IP address, then that link won't work. And of course, your workflow falls apart. The authentication secret is really just part of your browser cookie. You want to make sure that it's kind of a jumble of different letters and numbers, and that it is unique to each server that you spin up. If you are not running any of Opmantek's other products, you can leave cookie type as NMIS. Otherwise, if you're running it with other Opmantek products like OpenAudit or OPConfig, OP events, etc., you can do single sign-on so that you can log into one product and then continue sharing that same browser cookie throughout all of your experience for the day. NMIS, of course, has the ability to generate emails, so you can actually set up all of your email information here. Now, it's important to understand that NMIS doesn't come with an email server built in. You can, of course, install one on the Opmantek virtual machine if you start with that. There are many free email servers that are available to you, but you can also very easily link into something like Microsoft 365 and route your messages through that account. One setting here of great interest is the combined emails setting towards the bottom of this panel. What the combined emails will do for you is that every time the system runs a thresholding check, it looks to see if there are any event alarms that are available. It can actually take all of those event alarms that come up and combine them all together to one email. So you get one email with multiple events in it, or it can send out individual emails for each event on its own. Generally speaking, if you're sending emails to a person, I like to see them combined. But if they're being sent to an automated help desk system that will then create a ticket for it, I prefer to send one email for each individual event to generate its own help desk ticket. The next piece toward the bottom here is node status mode. Classic mode is what's called the NMIS Classic. It gives you multiple levels of system status and device status. Coarse is very much a red-green option that's there. We do recommend strongly going with fine-grained, as it will give you a much more refined view of the health of a device. In many cases, if you start with something like coarse, it'll show a device as being super healthy until it completely melts down into a puddle of slag. Whereas the classic version will go from green, being perfectly healthy, to if it's at 99.9% health, it'll go immediately to yellow. And then it will go to red once it gets to the point where it's at failure. So you have a very wide view of yellow, where fine-grained gives you many more levels within there. You can be perfectly healthy, you can be a little off today, you can be rather grumpy, and it goes on and on. Groups, NMIS has the concept of metadata tags. Groups is the primary or key label used throughout NMIS and actually throughout all of Opmantek solutions to group devices together for management. So we ship with about a dozen groups predefined, just as examples. You can keep what you want. You can delete the ones you don't want to use. Taking a quick look at that, I'm just going to add and edit groups. Move basic setup over. So you can see here, for example, we have a list of group names and how many members or devices are in each group. So for example, in the NMIS 8 group, there are 4 members. I can delete any group that I want to. You can delete a group that has members in it. If you do, the devices aren't deleted from the system. They're just orphaned. They need to be reassigned to a new group at some point. And once you've made sure that you have some groups here, your next step is to add nodes. So if I hit nodes, add nodes, I'll get the add nodes panel. And from here, I can provide it with a name. a hostname or IP address, a group, my SMP community string, and any other optional information that I want to provide to this. All right, let's switch back over to the PowerPoint again. So at this point, you've now completed NMIS setup. So you've installed the server, you've sized the server, you've made sure the server is configured and can touch all of your devices. You've gone through the setup, you've done your email, you decided to use fine-grained or coarse mode or classic. You've also set up a few groups, and maybe you've added a handful of devices. So at this point, again, I know I've said it earlier, but I do want to reiterate it. Our strong recommendation is don't start changing big picture settings on how NMIS operates until you really understand and are comfortable with the information that NMIS is collecting, how it's presenting it, and what it's doing with that information behind the scenes. So what are the next steps? What are the other things that need to be done in NMIS after you've added some devices? So think of it now. You've got NMIS up and running. You've added a couple of groups. Maybe you've added 3, 5, 10 devices to the system, one at a time, and you've gotten it working. So the next steps are to really come in and start working on the idea of how do I tell people when things aren't working properly? So the first step to that is contact setup. So you'll actually add contacts, people to be notified. Now that could be an individual or it could be an email address assigned to your help desk system. It could be an email address for some kind of an online call solution that will take your email, dial a phone number, and read the email to an engineer at 2 o'clock in the morning. However you want to notify your people, you want to be able to create a contact entry for that individual. You'll need to be adding things like duty times. So when do they start and when do they end? What days of the week do they work? What level of events do you want them to be notified on? What their email address is? You can add a location, a mobile number if you're going to be using SMS text messaging, a pager if you're going to be using paging, etc. So add your contacts first. Back to the setup menu again. After you've done your contacts, you'll actually start creating what are called escalations. Now, an escalation is simply a rule that says, if this event occurs under these circumstances, contact these people in this method. And so emails, notifications, and escalations goes in great detail on how you can contact people. It allows you to break down devices by manufacturer, device type, device role, the group that a device is assigned to, the type of event. You can even go into event elements. So you could say, if I get an event on this one interface of this one device, then I want to be able to notify my CEO via email. So you set up your emails, notifications, and escalations rules. The escalation policy system in NMIS is extremely flexible. It's already pre-built to handle 24 hours of escalations, starting at what we call level 0 or time 0, which is the moment that an event occurs, all the way up through 24 hours after that point. Once you hit 24 hours, the system recycles and starts back at level 0 again with notifications. Notifications continue until someone either acknowledges the event or until the event clears. So NMIS handles stateful events. So for example, is the room light on or is it off, right? It's one or the other. It's a stateful event. You also have what are called thresholding or rising events. So for example, temperature. And you may have multiple threshold levels on temperature, a minor alarm, it's getting warm, a major alarm, hey, it's hot, a critical alarm, oh my gosh, it's really warm, my shoes are melting to the floor. And of course, a fatal alarm might be, my router has completely melted down into a pile of slag and it's dripping out of my server rack at this point. So many different flexible ways of notifying people. The system itself can handle things like NetSend, email, SMS text messaging, pager text messaging, and you can actually write your own connectors in there. So if you have a solution that you want to use and it's not handled already inside NMIS, you can actually create your own. Another option I want to point out is the idea of node customization. So you can actually select a device. So let's pick this router. And from here, I can actually add things like contact, location. I can leave it as whatever type of device NMIS determines it is. I can change things like its description, its display name, and I can reassign speeds for every single interface. And I can I can override kind of the global settings and change things like speed limiting, collections, whether I'm collecting or not collecting on that device, on that interface, and on and on. So lots of different options that are there as well. A few more pieces for us to look at here today. And this is an important one, and I think it's one that we really need to make sure that we point out. Under Setup Model Policy, so this really digs into advanced inventory and performance collection. So this is a lot of the extra table structures and data that you'll find that's available in a device's SNMP MIB that are really optional. Do you want to collect on it? Many of these will be disabled by default, because this can really add size to your database and can also add overhead to polling your device. So if any of these are marked as disabled, NMIS will not collect that section of information from the device when it does a collection. So go through this. Again, that is Setup Model Policy. Again, this is all in the presentation that's available to you. Next would be Event Configuration. So event configuration turns on and off events globally and how they're handled. So is it a stateful event? How is it handled? Will it be logged? Will thresholds be done? Are statuses done? Is it stateful? And what the canceling events are. Generally speaking, you don't have to touch this at all. So the event configuration is generally predefined. You don't have to touch it. You should be good to go. Next is threshold alert tuning. Again, at this point in configuring, we're actually getting beyond the 80%. We are now well into the 20% of users who want to be able to really customize the way NMIS works as a network monitoring solution and how it does its thing. Threshold alert tuning is all about changing the alarm levels for the events that are being monitored. So for example, as the temperature on my little Cisco router goes up and up, where do I want to start raising events in the system? At what temperature points do I want to raise alerts? And do I want to put different temperature points on different types of devices or on an individual device specifically? So I might have a device or a group of devices in a group, and I want to apply a specific set of temperature settings or memory settings or thresholds based on different types of parameters in those metadata tags. That's all done through threshold alert tuning. And finally today is polling policy. So in polling policies, and this was new in 8.6.4, I believe. Previously in NMIS, everything was polled every 5 minutes. With polling policies, you can actually define different periods of polling, how often devices will be polled, all the way starting at a 1 minute interval, all the way up to once a day, once a week, once a month. So depending on how you want to poll your devices, totally up to you. You can create your own polling policies and then assign those to devices. All right. The PDF handout does include some bonus extras for you that go into troubleshooting device collection, as well as troubleshooting the performance of the NMIS server. Please take a few moments to take a look at those slides, take a look at those screens and the charts that they bring up. Feel free to ask any questions. This concludes today's seminar on NMIS installation, setup, and customization. Again, my name is Mark Henry. If you have any questions at all, feel free to reach out to me directly at markh@opmantek.com. That is my live email address. I do reply to everyone who emails me. Happy to help you out, point you to a page on the wiki for reference, or make an introduction to any of our sales teams globally. Thank you all very much for your time today, and I look forward to seeing you at a future webinar.